The cold was the first thing he felt every morning. It wasn't a gentle chill, but a deep, biting cold that seemed to come from inside the concrete itself. It seeped through the flattened cardboard box that served as his mattress and through the thin, worn blanket he pulled up to his chin. He would lie there for a few minutes, eyes still closed, trying to pretend he was somewhere else. Anywhere else. But the rumble of a distant subway train and the smell of damp city air would always pull him back to reality. He was 16 years old, and the world was a hard, cold place. He didn't have a name that people used anymore. To the few who noticed him, he was just the kid. To most, he was invisible. He had mastered the art of being a ghost. He learned to walk with a slight hunch, his shoulders curled inwards, making himself smaller. He never looked people in the eye. Instead, he watched their feet. He could tell a lot from shoes. Scuffed work boots meant a long day ahead. Clean, white sneakers meant a student, maybe someone his own age, rushing to a class he couldn't imagine. High heels clicked with a confidence he had never known. He watched them all hurry past, a river of faces and feet flowing around him as if he were just a rock in the stream. His world was a map of survival, drawn in alleyways and underpasses. His home, for now, was a dry spot beneath a bridge, hidden from the main road by a thick curtain of overgrown weeds. It wasn't much, but it was a place where he could sleep without being woken up by police officers telling him to move along. His only neighbors were the pigeons who cooed and fought over discarded food scraps, and sometimes another shadow figure who would nod silently before finding their own corner of the darkness. Mornings were for the library. It was a sanctuary of warmth and quiet. He would wait on the steps until it opened, slipping in just after the first wave of morning commuters. He never took a book out. He was afraid they'd ask for an address, a piece of ID, things he didn't have. Instead, he would find a chair in a remote corner and pretend to read. He'd stare at the same page of a history book for an hour, his mind not on the words but on the feeling of the chair supporting his back and the heat tickling his skin. He would watch people through the large glass windows, seeing them laugh and talk on their phones, living lives that felt like they were happening on another planet. In the library, he could almost feel normal for a couple of hours. He could sit and just be, without the constant fear of being told he didn't belong, but his stomach always reminded him of the truth. By midday, the hunger would start, a dull ache that slowly grew into a sharp, demanding pain. This is when his work began. He would walk the streets, his eyes scanning the sidewalks, the tops of trash cans, the areas behind restaurants. It was a grim treasure hunt. A half-eaten apple, still firm and white, was a feast. The end of a loaf of bread, slightly squashed, was enough for 2 meals. He learned the schedules of the food trucks and the cafes. He knew which one threw out their unsold pastries at 11 and which one put the day-old sandwiches in a separate bag by the back door. There was a shame that came with it, a hot flush in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. He would wait until no one was looking, his movements quick and practiced, grabbing the small bag and disappearing into an alley before anyone could see. He would eat his findings in private, sitting on a crate, savoring every crumb. It wasn't about taste. It was about fuel. It was about silencing the ache for just a little while longer. His entire life was contained in a faded blue backpack. It wasn't heavy, but it held everything he owned. There was the thin blanket, his only defense against the cold. There was an extra pair of socks, thick and woolly, a lucky find from a donation bin that he treasured more than anything. Clean, dry socks were a luxury that felt like a royal indulgence. There was a toothbrush, worn down to the nub, and a small, almost empty tube of toothpaste he had found in a public restroom. And then there was the stone. It was a small, smooth gray stone, perfectly oval, that fit in the palm of his hand. He didn't know where it came from, not really. He just had a fuzzy memory, like a dream of being by a river. The sun was warm and someone was holding his hand, a hand that was big and safe. He must have found it then. It was his only connection to a life before the streets, a life he couldn't quite remember but felt he missed terribly. At night, when the loneliness felt like a physical weight on his chest, he would hold the stone, its smoothness a small comfort in his rough world. It was a silent promise that he hadn't always been just a ghost. He tried not to think about the future. Hope was a dangerous thing. It was a sharp, painful feeling that made the present even harder to bear. Hoping for a warm meal only made the hunger feel worse. Dreaming of a bed only made the concrete feel colder. So he learned to live in small, manageable chunks of time. He didn't think about tomorrow or next week or next year. He only thought about the next hour. Where will I be for the next hour? How can I stay safe for the next hour? It was a way of surviving, of keeping the mind from breaking under the weight of it all. He saw other people on the streets, the ones who talked to themselves or shouted at the sky. He knew that their minds had broken, and he was terrified of the same thing happening to him. So he stayed quiet, he stayed invisible, and he focused on the simple, immediate task of getting through the day as the sun began to set. Painting the sky in shades of orange and purple he barely noticed. He would start his journey back to the bridge. The city changed at night. The crowds of workers thinned out, replaced by people laughing and dressed up for the evening. The streets felt more dangerous then. He would stick to the shadows, his steps quick and light. He was just a shadow himself, a fleeting shape that people might see out of the corner of their eye but would forget a moment later. He would find his spot, pull out his blanket, and listen to the sounds of the city settling down for the night. He would eat his last meal of the day, whatever he had managed to find, and then he would lie back, the cold already starting to creep into his bones. He would close his eyes, hold his smooth stone, and try to empty his mind. He wasn't a boy with dreams or a past. He wasn't a son or a friend. He was just a homeless kid, another shadow in the concrete canyons of the city, waiting for the cycle to begin all over again. The sky turned a dark, bruised purple long before the first drop of rain fell. He felt it in the air, a heavy dampness that clung to his clothes and made the cold seep deeper into his bones. When the rain finally came, it wasn't a gentle shower but a sudden, angry downpour, as if the sky had opened up and dumped all its frustration onto the city. The water hit the pavement with a force that kicked up a dirty spray, soaking his worn-out sneakers and chilling his feet in an instant. He pulled his thin jacket tighter, a useless gesture against the sheer weight of the water, and started to run. His world narrowed to the search for shelter, a desperate hunt for any small corner of the city that would offer a brief escape from the storm. He dodged through the crowded sidewalks, a blur of wet rags and frantic motion, ignored by the people huddled under their umbrellas. They were in their own worlds, hurrying home to warmth and light, places he couldn't even allow himself to imagine. He saw an awning outside a closed shop, but two other figures were already huddled there, their faces grim and unwelcoming. He kept moving. The water was plastering his hair to his forehead and dripping into his eyes, blurring the city lights into streaks of color. He was starting to lose hope, his shivers becoming more violent when he saw it. At the end of a forgotten street, huddled behind a screen of overgrown bush, was the skeleton of an old building. It looked like a school, its windows boarded up or shattered, a nitrogen monoxide trespassing sign faded and hanging by a single nail. It was perfect. He circled the building once, his heart thumping with a mix of fear and excitement. He found a low window at the back, the glass pane gone, leaving a dark, jagged hole. It was an invitation. He scrambled through, the sharp edges of the broken frame catching on his jacket for a second before he tumbled onto the dusty floor inside. The silence that met him was a shock after the roar of the rain. It was a thick, heavy silence filled with the smell of damp wood, decaying paper, and years of neglect. He was in a hallway, and a faint light came from a set of double doors at the far end. Driven by a curiosity that was stronger than his caution, he pushed them open and stepped inside. The room was huge. It must have been an auditorium or assembly hall. Rows of empty seats faced a stage, and the only light came from the grimy, high-up windows where the rain streaked down like tears. And there, in the center of the stage, covered by a large, dusty canvas tarp, was a giant shape. It looked like some kind of sleeping beast. He had never seen anything like it. He crept up the side steps of the stage, his footsteps silent on the worn wood. He stood before the shape, his breath held tight in his chest. He reached out a hand, his fingers grimy and trembling, and grabbed the edge of the tarp. He pulled. The canvas slid away with a soft whisper, revealing something so strange and beautiful it made his heart ache. It was a piano. A grand piano, he would later learn it was called, but to him, it was just a monster of black and white wood. It was dusty and some of the keys looked yellowed, but it was magnificent. It had a kind of dignity that seemed out of place in this forgotten room. He ran a hand along its smooth, curved side, the wood cool beneath his touch. He had seen things like this on television screens and store windows, but he had never been close to one. It felt like a creature from another world. His eyes were drawn to the keyboard. A long row of white keys with black keys set in between them. They looked like teeth, or maybe like a city skyline he had once seen in a picture book. He wondered what they were for. He knew, in a vague sort of way, that music came from them. But his own world had no music, only the sounds of survival, the screech of tires, the shouts of angry people, the constant rumble of the city. He slowly lifted his right hand. His fingers were calloused and dirty from the streets. They looked wrong touching something so clean, so perfect. He hesitated then, with a deep breath, he pressed down on one of the white keys near the middle. The sound that came out was so unexpected, so pure, that he jumped back as if he'd been shocked. It was a single note, clear and strong, and it hung in the silent air for a long moment before fading away. It wasn't a loud sound, but it filled the entire room, pushing back the silence and the smell of decay. It was a clean sound in a dirty world. He looked at his finger, then back at the key, as if trying to understand the magic that had just happened. He pressed another key, a different note, then another. He was like a child discovering his own voice, experimenting with sounds that had been locked away inside this strange beast. He wasn't making music, not yet. He was just setting free a series of beautiful, lonely notes that echoed the emptiness he felt inside. The abandoned school became his secret. Every day, as soon as the library grew too crowded or his stomach started to ache with hunger, he would find his way back to the broken window. The dusty auditorium was no longer just a shelter from the rain. It was a sanctuary. It was the one place in the entire city where he felt he belonged. He would sit on the piano bench, his feet dangling because he was still too small to reach the floor, and he would explore. He had no idea how to play. He didn't know about scales or chords or sheet music. He only knew what sounded right to his ear. He started to remember bits of melodies. A faint tune from a music box he thought he might have owned a long, long time ago. The jingle from a commercial he had heard playing on a television in a shop window. He would hunt for these notes on the keyboard, his fingers moving slowly at first, then with more confidence as he learned the patterns. It became his new treasure hunt. Instead of looking for scraps of food, he was searching for sounds. And when he found a melody he recognized, a feeling of joy so powerful it almost hurt would wash over him. But the most important things he played were the songs he didn't know. They came from inside him. He would close his eyes and let his fingers wander, and the piano would speak for him. On days when the cold was unbearable and he hadn't found anything to eat, the music would be slow and sad, a mournful weeping that filled the hall with his loneliness. On days when a police officer had yelled at him or someone had looked at him with disgust, the music would be angry and fast, a storm of crashing notes that let out all his frustration and rage. And sometimes, on rare afternoons when the sun would stream through the high windows and light up the dust motes dancing in the air, the music would be soft and hopeful. A gentle questioning of what might be, the piano became his best friend, his diary, his voice. He could tell it things he could never tell a person. He could pour all the pain and fear and confusion of his life into the keys, and instead of judging him, the piano would turn it into something beautiful. For the first time in years, he was not just surviving. He was feeling. He was creating. The ghost who had haunted the streets was starting to become a real person again, a person with a voice, a person who could make something lovely out of nothing but dust and silence and memory. He was still just a homeless kid to the rest of the world, but in that forgotten hall, with his hands on the keys, he was a musician. And that was a secret that was worth more than any meal or any warm bed. In the apartment building next to the forgotten school, an elderly woman named Eleanor lived a life as quiet as the dust motes that danced in the afternoon sun. Her days were gentle, predictable, and often lonely. Her husband had passed away a few years ago, and the silence he left behind was a constant companion. She filled her hours with books, with watering her small collection of ferns, and with the quiet ritual of making tea. Every evening, as the city outside her window softened into a blue-gray haze, she would sit in her favorite armchair, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands, and listen to the sounds of the night. She heard the sirens, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional shout from the street below. They were the sounds of a world she was no longer a part of. Then, one evening, a new sound drifted in. It was so faint at first she thought she was imagining it. It was a single, clear note that hung in the air, pure and lonely. Then another, and another. It was the sound of a piano. She leaned forward in her chair, her tea forgotten, and strained to hear. The music was not like the polished, perfect songs she heard on the radio. This was different. It was raw, full of hesitations and surprising rushes of speed. It was a conversation, a story being told without any words. She could hear a deep sadness in the melody, a kind of longing that felt so real it made her own heart ache. It was the sound of someone pouring their whole soul into the keys. She sat there, mesmerized, until the last note faded away and the only sound was the familiar hum of the city. The next night she was waiting. She found herself listening for it, her ear tuned to the quiet frequencies of the evening. Just as she was about to give up, it began again. A different melody this time, but with the same honest, unfiltered emotion. It became her secret ritual. Every night she would turn off her television, make her tea, and sit by the open window, a silent audience to the ghost pianist. The music became the highlight of her day. It filled the empty spaces in her quiet apartment and in her heart. She tried to imagine who could be playing. A retired professional, perhaps practicing in secret? But the music felt too wild, too untamed for that. It had the innocence of a child and the sorrow of someone who had lived a very long, very hard life. It was a puzzle she couldn't solve. One night, the music was particularly mournful. A slow, haunting melody that spoke of deep despair. It was more than just sad. It was a cry for help. Eleanor felt a surge of concern she couldn't ignore. She had to know where the music was coming from. She had to know if the person playing it was okay. The next morning, driven by a purpose she hadn't felt in years, she decided to investigate. She put on a sensible coat and comfortable shoes and followed the direction she thought the sound came from. It led her directly to the old, abandoned school. The building looked even more sad and forgotten in the daylight. The "No Trespassing" sign did little to deter her. She circled the property, her heart thumping a little, until she found the broken window at the back. Peering through the grimy glass, she could see a hallway leading to a set of large doors. She knew that's where the music was coming from, but she didn't go in. It felt like trespassing, not just on the property, but on a very private world. Instead, she went home and formulated a plan. That evening, she made 2 sandwiches, wrapping them carefully in a napkin. She also filled a thermos with hot soup. She returned to the school just as dusk was falling. She slipped through the broken window, her movements slow and careful, and placed the small bundle of food just inside the door on a clean patch of floor. Then she left without making a sound. The next morning she returned. The sandwiches and the thermos were gone. A small warmth spread through her chest. It was the beginning of a silent conversation. Every evening she would leave a small offering, a piece of fruit, a chocolate bar, a warm pair of socks she found in the back of her closet, and every morning it would be gone. She still hadn't seen the pianist, but she felt a connection to them, a fragile thread of care stretched across the darkness. She would sometimes arrive just as the music started, and she would stand in the shadows of the hallway, listening. She saw him once, just his back. He was smaller than she imagined, a scrawny boy hunched over the keys, his body swaying with the music. He was completely lost in his own world, and she didn't want to break the spell. He knew he was being watched. At first, it filled him with a cold, sharp fear. His sanctuary was no longer a secret. Someone had found his hiding place. But then the food started appearing. It wasn't a trap. It was a gift. This person, this shadow, didn't want to hurt him. They were helping him. The fear slowly began to mix with a cautious curiosity. Who was this person? Why were they being so kind? He started to wonder what they looked like, what they sounded like. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long now felt a little less heavy. One evening, he decided he had to know. After he finished playing, instead of slipping out the back way, he hid in the wings of the stage, his heart pounding like a drum. He heard the soft creak of the door and the quiet footsteps. He watched as a small, gray-haired woman walked cautiously to the spot where she always left the food. She placed a small bag on the floor and paused for a moment, listening to the silence where music had just been. He took a deep breath, his whole body trembling, and stepped out of the shadows. The woman jumped, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh, my," she said, her voice soft and kind. "You gave me a fright?" He just stood there, unable to speak, his eyes wide. He was a mess of dirty clothes and tangled hair, a street kid caught in the act of receiving charity. He felt a hot wave of shame wash over him, but the woman didn't look at him with pity or disgust. She looked at him with gentle, curious eyes. "It was you," she said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. "You're the one who plays the piano." He managed a small, almost imperceptible nod. She smiled, and it was a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she said. Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. Not, "You're a mess," or "You shouldn't be here," but "It's beautiful." For the first time in as long as he could remember, someone had seen past the dirt and the rags and seen something inside him that was worthy of praise. They had seen his music. They had seen him. "I'm Eleanor," she said, taking a small step forward. He couldn't find his voice to tell her his name. He wasn't sure he remembered it. "That's a real gift you have," she continued, her voice still gentle. "Have you ever thought about sharing it? With more people?" The question hung in the air between them. Sharing it? The idea was terrifying. His music was his secret, his private language. It was for the empty hall and for the darkness. To play for others, to be seen and heard, was the most frightening thing he could imagine. But as he looked at her kind face, a new feeling began to bubble up inside him, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. It was a tiny, fragile spark of hope. It was terrifying because hope could be crushed and it could hurt. But it was also exhilarating because for the first time, he was being offered a future that wasn't just about surviving until the next day. He was being offered a future where he could be the boy who played the piano. And in that dusty, forgotten hall, a whole new world began to open up, one beautiful, terrifying note at a time. The idea hung in the dusty air of the old auditorium, fragile and terrifying. "A small performance?" Eleanor had said, her voice as soft as the melodies he played. "Just a little fundraiser for the community center. Nothing big, I promise." But to him, it sounded like being asked to climb the tallest building in the city without a rope. The thought of it sent a cold snake of fear slithering through his stomach. Play for people? For real people, not just the empty seats and ghosts of the past? His mind recoiled from the image. He saw their faces, a sea of strangers with clean clothes and judging eyes. They would see him, the boy with the tangled hair and the worn-out shoes, and they would know. They would know he didn't belong. For days after Eleanor mentioned it, he couldn't even bring himself to touch the piano keys. The instrument, his one true friend, suddenly felt like a stranger. The sanctuary had become a stage, and the silence was no longer peaceful. It was filled with the imagined sound of whispers and laughter. All the old feelings he had worked so hard to push down came flooding back. He was just a homeless kid, an imposter. What did he have to offer anyone? His music wasn't real music, not like the kind he'd heard on the radio. It was just a jumble of feelings, a mess of noise he made in the dark. To put it out in the light, to let other people hear it, felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. Eleanor didn't push him. She could see the fear in his eyes, the way his shoulders hunched a little lower whenever she brought it up. She would just sit quietly in her usual spot, listening, and sometimes she would bring him a little treat, like a warm cookie from the bakery. "There's no pressure," she said one afternoon, as he sat on the edge of the stage, his feet dangling, refusing to look at the piano. "The offer is there if you ever want it. But your music is a gift, whether anyone else hears it or not. It's a gift to yourself." Her words were kind, but they didn't quiet the storm raging inside him. The night before the fundraiser, he made a decision. He would do it. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because he didn't want to disappoint Eleanor, the one person who had shown him kindness. Or maybe, deep down, a tiny, desperate part of him wanted to know if it was possible. Could a boy from the shadows step into the light and not be burned? The fear was still there, a giant, heavy lump in his throat, but it was now mixed with something else. A flicker of defiance. The next day felt like a dream. Eleanor brought him a set of clean clothes. They were simple, a pair of dark pants and a plain button-up shirt, but they felt like a costume. The fabric was soft and foreign against his skin. He washed his face and hands in the restroom of a gas station, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back was still his, but the eyes seemed wider, more frightened. He barely recognized the clean, somewhat put-together boy staring back at him. He felt like a fraud dot as they walked to the community center. Every step felt heavier than the last. The evening air was cool, but his palms were sweating. The center was a small brick building, and warm light spilled from its windows. He could hear the murmur of voices and the clinking of glasses from inside. This was it. The edge of the cliff. He stopped, his feet rooted to the sidewalk. "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't do it." Eleanor stopped beside him. She didn't grab his arm or try to pull him forward. She just stood there, a quiet, steady presence. "It's okay to be scared," she said softly. "But you don't have to be perfect. You just have to share a little piece of your heart. That's all anyone is asking." She looked at him, her eyes full of a belief in him that he couldn't find in himself. "They're going to love you because you're real. And your music is the most real thing I've ever heard." Her words were a small hand pushing him gently forward. He took a breath, the air catching in his lungs, and nodded. They went inside. The room was smaller than he'd imagined, filled with folding chairs and people chatting happily. There was a table with baked goods and a jar for donations. It was also normal. He felt like an alien who had just landed on a strange planet. Eleanor led him to the side of the small makeshift stage. "You're on after they do the announcements," she whispered, giving his hand a quick, reassuring squeeze before finding a seat in the front row. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He watched the organizer, a cheerful woman with a loud voice, thank everyone for coming. Then she said his name, or at least the name Eleanor had given him, the young pianist. It was time. His legs felt like they were made of lead as he walked up the 3 steps to the stage. The small spotlight hit him, and for a second he was blinded. He sat down on the bench in front of the polished black piano. It was different from his old one in the school. This one was clean, perfectly tuned. It looked intimidating. He looked out at the crowd. All the faces he had imagined were there, and they were all looking at him. Dozens of eyes, all fixed on him. His mind went completely blank. The melodies, the feelings, the stories he had poured into the keys for months, they were all gone. There was only a terrifying, buzzing silence. He could feel a drop of sweat run down his temple. He was going to fail. He was going to sit here in silence until they laughed him off the stage. Then he saw Eleanor's face in the front row. She wasn't looking at him with pity or pressure. She was just smiling, a gentle, encouraging smile. And then he did the only thing he could think of. He closed his eyes. The world of faces and lights and expectations disappeared. There was only the darkness behind his eyelids and the smooth, cool ivory of the keys beneath his fingers. He took a deep breath, and he let his fingers remember. They didn't need his eyes or his mind. They knew the way. He began to play. He didn't play a song that anyone had ever heard before. He played his story. The first notes were slow and hesitant, like the lonely footsteps of a boy walking through empty streets. It was the sound of hunger, of cold concrete, of being invisible. The melody was sparse and sad, each note hanging in the air like a question. A hush fell over the room. The chatter stopped, the clinking of glasses ceased. All that could be heard was the quiet, haunting music, then the melody began to change. A new note crept in, a note of wonder. It was the sound of a single, clear note echoing in a dusty hall. The music grew a little stronger, a little more complex. It was the feeling of discovery, of finding a voice when he thought he had none. It was the joy of creating something beautiful out of nothing. As the song continued, it swelled with a new emotion. A warmth spread through the melody, a feeling of connection and hope. It was the sound of a kind face, a warm sandwich, a thermos of soup. It was the feeling of being seen, not for what he was, but for who he could be. The music was no longer just sad or lonely. It was resilient. It was the sound of a spirit that had been beaten down but refused to break. It was a song of survival, of finding light in the darkest of places. He played with everything he had. He wasn't thinking about technique or making mistakes. He was just pouring his entire life, his entire soul into the keys. The music filled the small room, wrapping around everyone in it. When he reached the end of his story, his fingers played one final soft chord. The note was gentle and full of peace, like a sigh of relief after a long, hard journey. He held his hands on the keys, his eyes still closed, and let the sound fade into silence. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was thick with emotion, a shared moment of understanding. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, holding their breath, living in the echo of the story they had just heard. Then a single person in the back started to clap. It was quickly joined by another and another, until the entire room erupted in a sound so loud and so powerful it almost knocked him off his bench. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar of emotion. People were on their feet. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. They were not just applauding his talent. They were applauding his struggle, his courage, his truth. They were applauding the soul of the boy who had shared his story with them. He opened his eyes and saw them all, standing and cheering for him. And for the first time in his life, standing in the spotlight, he didn't feel like a homeless kid or an imposter. He felt like a musician, and he felt, for the first time, truly seen. The roar of the applause was a physical thing, a wave of sound that washed over him, warm and powerful. For a long moment he just sat there, his hands still resting on the keys, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had never heard a sound like that, a sound made just for him. It wasn't the angry shout of a police officer or the impatient honk of a car horn. It was a sound of pure, unfiltered appreciation. He slowly stood up, his legs feeling shaky, and looked out at the sea of faces. They weren't judging him. They were smiling, some with tears in their eyes. He saw Eleanor in the front row, her face beaming, her hands clapping harder than anyone else. He gave a small, awkward bow, the way he had seen people do in old movies, and quickly walked off the stage, his heart pounding with a feeling he couldn't name. It was a mix of terror and a soaring, breathtaking joy. As soon as he was in the wings, Eleanor was there, wrapping him in a hug that smelled of lavender and kindness. "Oh, my dear," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You were magnificent. Absolutely magnificent." He didn't know what to say, so he just stood there, letting the warmth of her hug seep into him. Then other people started to come up to him. A man with a kind face shook his hand and told him his music touched his soul. A woman pressed a $20 bill into his hand, insisting he take it. He tried to give it back, but she wouldn't let him. "You earned it," she said firmly. He felt overwhelmed, like a small ship caught in a sudden, unexpected storm of kindness. He wasn't used to this much attention, this much positive energy. It was both wonderful and terrifying. The next morning, he woke up in his usual spot under the bridge, but the world felt different. The cold concrete seemed harder, the distant traffic louder. The memory of the warm lights and the roaring applause felt like a dream from another life. He was still just a homeless kid, But as he sat up, he found the crumpled $20 bill in his pocket. It was real. He went to a small cafe and, for the first time in his life, bought himself a hot breakfast. He sat at a small table by the window, sipping coffee and eating a plate of eggs and toast, feeling like a king. People walked by outside, but for the first time, he didn't feel invisible. He felt like he had a secret. The secret didn't stay secret for long. A young woman who wrote a blog for the local online newspaper had been at the fundraiser. She wrote a small story with the headline, "The Ghost Pianist of the Old Schoolhouse." She wrote about the mystery of the music, the discovery of the boy, and the emotional performance that had left the whole room in tears. She didn't use his name because she didn't know it, but she described his music with words that made it sound like magic. The story was shared over and over again. People who had lived near the old school for years commented, saying they had heard the music too and wondered where it came from. The boy, who had spent so much of his life trying to be invisible, had suddenly become the most interesting mystery in the city. A few days after the article was published, Eleanor found him at the school, a nervous energy buzzing around her. "Someone is here to see you," she said, a wide smile on her face. "He's a music professor from the city college." He was at the performance. The boy's heart sank. A professor? A man in a tweed jacket with glasses who would ask him questions he couldn't answer? He wanted to run, to disappear back into the shadows, but Eleanor took his hand. "It's okay," she said. "Just talk to him." The professor was not what he expected. He was a tall, thin man with a gentle face and kind eyes. He didn't talk down to him or look at him with pity. He just sat and listened to him play. After he finished, the professor didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at the piano, then at the boy, a look of deep thought on his face. "You have a rare gift," he said finally, his voice quiet but serious. "A natural, raw talent that I haven't seen in a long time. It would be a crime to let it go to waste." Then he made an offer that was so unbelievable it felt like a trick. He offered the boy a full scholarship to the music college, a place to study, to learn, to grow. And even more incredible, he told him the college had a program for students in difficult situations, and they could find him a place to live in one of the dormitories. The boy was silent. A dormitory? A real room with a bed and a door that locked? The idea was so foreign it was hard to grasp. It felt like a trap, a beautiful, wonderful trap. All his life he had learned that when something seems too good to be true, it usually is. He looked at Eleanor, who was watching him with tears in her eyes. She nodded, a small, encouraging nod. This was real. This was his chance. He took a deep breath, and in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, he said, "Okay." Moving into the dormitory was like landing on another planet. The room was small, just a bed, a desk, and a closet, but to him it was a palace. He had never had a space that was just his own, a place where he could close the door and be safe. For the first few nights he couldn't sleep. He was used to the sounds of the street, the sirens, the shouting, but the silence of the dorm room was deafening. He would lie on the soft bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange sense of loss for the life he had left behind. He missed the freedom of the streets, the quiet solitude of the dusty auditorium. Here, there were rules. There were schedules. There were people everywhere. He felt like an imposter. He would walk through the hallways of the music department, surrounded by students who had been playing for years. They talked about composers he had never heard of and techniques he didn't understand. He was in classes where everyone else seemed to know what was going on, and he was just trying to keep his head above water. The raw, emotional music that came so naturally to him in the old schoolhouse now felt clumsy and amateur in the practice rooms, where he could hear other students playing complicated scales and sonatas with ease. The old fear crept back in. He was just a homeless kid who got lucky. He didn't belong here, but then he would sit down at a piano. The college had dozens of them in soundproof practice rooms that he could use whenever he wanted. He would close the door, shut out the world, and just play. He would start with the simple, sad melodies of his past, the music that was his own language. And then, slowly, he would start to add the new things he was learning in his classes. A chord progression he had studied, a new rhythm he had been taught. He was learning to weave his raw emotion with the structure of music theory. His music was changing, growing, becoming something new. It was still his story, but now it was a story with a future. He started to find his place. He made a few friends, other students who were too focused on their own music to care about where he came from. He discovered the library not just as a place to get warm, but as a treasure trove of knowledge with endless books about composers and the history of music. He even started eating in the cafeteria, at first feeling like everyone was watching him, but slowly realizing that no one really cared. They were all just there to eat and study and live their own lives. One afternoon, months after he first moved in, he was in a practice room on the top floor of the music building. The sun was streaming through a large window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, just like they used to in the old school auditorium. He was working on a new piece of music, something that was complicated and challenging, but still full of his own voice. He looked down at his hands, now clean and strong, moving across the keys with a confidence he never thought he would have. He looked out the window at the sprawling city below. He could see the bridge where he used to sleep, a small, dark arch in the distance. It felt like a lifetime ago. He was no longer a ghost in that city. He was a part of it. He was no longer just a homeless kid. He was a student, a musician, a person with a name and a future. His life was no longer a song of survival, but a new melody, full of complex chords and hopeful harmonies. And he knew, with a certainty that filled his entire being, that this was only the beginning.